Hi, welcome. So today we're talking about healthy range extension with a particular focus on these vicious cycles that we can get stuck in as we try to improve and expand our range, and sort of the cost that sometimes comes with trying to just have like a wider range versus focusing on the quality of the voice and these other things. So it's like something that everybody wants, of course, is to like, how do I expand my range? Um, and sometimes ultimately, it's a balance thing, right? And so people need different things to expand their range. And so I'm going to go over a number of tools. I think this is one of the hard things about teaching the voice is like, yes, we use this analogy of like a singer being like an athlete, like this being a sport. And with that comes this concept of like, well, I need to like condition and push my voice. There's some truth to the conditioning aspect of things, but these are very small muscles. So it's very different from the amount of force that we put into like lifting weights or something like that. And so it's that's an important aspect of it. But really, with the voice, like what makes for healthy range extension is thinking about this athlete thing in a slightly more complex way. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind is like lifting weights and like like this happens with a number of uh, types of things like yoga, right? Where we get into like power yoga and all these things that kind of veer away from the practice a little bit because they're sort of westernized, consumerized, kind of like this concept of like uh, like if you just do these short, like really intense workout sessions, like your voice is going to get better. And it's more complex, right? Like an athlete, even when they're going through cycles of conditioning, you have to stretch, you have to work on efficiency, and honestly, those are the things that help us expand our range more than anything else. And so, yes, the conditioning and the consistent practice is a huge part of this, but I want to focus this time on healthy range extension, which is a little bit more about some of the subtleties that actually help us. My teacher back in the day would always say, when the note becomes available to you. And so it's a slightly different approach. Thank you. Yeah, this is going to be really, really great. It involves a lot of the topics that we've already been discussing. So if you're someone who follows me regularly, um, this will ring a bell, but um, it's really the approach that's important. And this is my whole practice is designed around this. How do we help expand the range in an efficient way? Um, so a lot of the times, like when we run into problems, it's because we're using all of the muscles all at the same time, and we don't have that good muscle isolation. So that's a huge part of this is being able to make sure that we're using the muscles that actually help us do whatever we're trying to accomplish with our voice and not carrying along a lot of extra weight. And so I think sometimes we attach ourselves to like, I'm feeling something in my voice, so therefore I must be doing something good. And a lot of the times, the actual feeling of like everything working well and in balance actually feels kind of disconcertingly light and effortless. And it's when it's out of balance that we start having to push or fight against certain things. And so a lot of the times, like we're putting in plenty of energy, but we're just putting it into the wrong places, and that makes the voice sort of catch up, and all sorts of things can happen from that. So we're going to talk about that. The other thing and topic is we carry tension with us, and when we learn, this is kind of intricately connected to muscle isolation. All this unnecessary motion causes certain things to just always get sort of hyper excited and always on. And when we learn to release that tension, our voice also expands in range. So sometimes, like the trick with the voice is you're going to feel like, oh, I need to just try harder and harder and harder. And you get in this really vicious cycle. And it's usually actually stepping back and having a different approach. And that's going to help you with your range extension. We're going to go over a ton of exercises, and please chime in if you have questions or things that you've noticed as you kind of go through the process of trying to extend the range. This is like, think of it from like a beginner. It's like early on, we're just trying to get enough notes to actually sing a song that we want. But as a more advanced singer, we're like, well, how do I actually expand that limit? And there's different rules and different strategies for different parts of our voice. And so I think that's also important to understand. Um, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Again, please ask questions. So the first thing that we want to talk about is a little bit of the stretching side of stuff. Now, I usually go over this pretty quickly, but really what's important is that you want to do this like throughout your practice. I think sometimes we're afraid to sort of be hands on, but like when I'm first starting, like I'm making sure that I can, move my shoulders, that I'm clearing space from here to here. And I think sometimes what happens is when we go like into like, okay, like just do some neck rolls and you're doing this, you're kind of not spending enough time. And when I'm in a lesson, like a lot of the times, like I want to just kind of bring this up and do a little bit just to become aware of the range of motion. But like I highly recommend like actually allow yourself to like stay in a stretch like this, even just simple like this, and breathe and start to notice the like tug against the shoulder. And you can actually also use your arm, sort of posing, right? So my left arm as I'm moving over to my right, and start to swivel, relax the jaw, and really allow yourself to sit in those postures. That's going to be really helpful. The other thing that's like kind of just like a fun trick is practice singing in different positions. So like sitting, standing, laying down on the floor. Change gravity because it changes just the way that you are feeling your muscles, and sometimes just our posture in general, right? How we stand, all of these things actually play a role in our voice. The shoulders riding up over time. So I'm always like, give yourself a little bit of time to squeeze these down, all of that kind of stuff. And then there's also self-laryngeal massage. So when we're like working on our range extension, I mean, we're conditioning a lot. It's just natural for these muscles to start to engage, especially as we go into territory where we're not sure about the right balance of energy that we're supposed to put into our voice. And so it really can be a very, very helpful thing just to feel that mobility here. Be very gentle. You can't really sing or talk when you're doing this, so you want to just do it silently. And what a lot of people notice is the second you start trying to move this, the tongue and the jaw and all of these muscles have to start to relax. This is really important because when you start to realize that connection between these two things, you start to see that flexibility with the larynx has a lot to do with all of these muscles, right? Obviously, jaw, tongue tension, the head and the neck coming out like this. All of these things just serve to constrict and hold things in place. And that's going to mess with our range more than anything else. So it's always, that's like always throughout this practice, you want to make sure that you've got flexibility here. And we'll talk about like when it's pressed down and locking that way or riding high. All of these things actually limit our range and our voice. We tend to follow what direction we go. So like when we sing lower, this starts to drop and lock. And when we sing higher, this starts to kind of rise and push up. And we just want it to be floating in the middle and be flexible. So I really, really like put a big sort of like star on this, which is like your stretch routine and everything that you do before and after you sing is incredibly important. And that's just like an athlete too, right? It's not just about conditioning your voice, it's about decompressing it. That's also why I do all of these humming exercises to start and stop my practice, is so that I can get all of this vibrating and kind of flexible and loose. So think of like your warm ups at first as really just like stretching before you start to condition. So think of it as that process. Because I think one thing I realized when I was younger and working on my voice is I was only conditioning my voice and I wasn't stretching it. And that actually, as you ride higher, your voice kind of starts to push up and it gets smaller this way. And as you try to push down, it gets smaller this way. And really, you're just chasing your range, but it's actually not extending your range. Um, um, what you're talking about, the stretching part of it, how long should it be? This is like, like play around with it. Like, obviously we can't do this like a huge extended stretch every time, but like, it's dependent on how you're feeling. So like, think of like maybe having a whole stretch routine practice before you do this. Don't do like super athletics, like stretch routine or anything like that, but anything to work on opening your hips actually, right? And then also, working with the mobility in the head and neck, spine, and shoulders. All of that stuff's going to be really helpful. Um, so yeah, I highly recommend it. And the point being is that you don't have to do it like just like right before, but like throughout your practice, you should stop and reset. Do some forward folds, all of that kind of stuff. It just helps to kind of reset the body, and ultimately catch yourself when you're starting to lock in place, right? A lot of the times when our voice isn't working well and something's out of balance, everything starts to try to like hold it together. And it's really more of a balance sport. So I highly recommend that. Like use the self-laryngeal massage thing, right? So that's like moving this around. You might even gently rub cough reflex area here. Be careful. If it's really tight, that's where we get that cough tickle thing. But you can kind of actually sort of loosen it out. And then there's also this bone up here, the hyoid bone, and this often gets fused together with the larynx. And so you can actually just gently try to just feel the space between it. Maybe do a little bit of breathing as you do that, and just watch sort of how the larynx can move, right? You can just try to see if you can move it separately and get a little bit of space from all these muscles around it. So when the voice isn't working well in these extreme situations, it gets locked in place, and then it starts to kind of pinch and squeeze, and we want to avoid that always, right? And that's where we get into these vicious cycles of like you're not just like actually extending your range, you're just putting in more tension, and so it can be really tricky. So highly recommend that. The next thing is the muscle isolation stuff. So it's really hard for us sometimes to separate between the front and the back of our vocal tract and how we form vowel shapes. That's why I have people go over these shapes so you actually know where the zones are. We'll do this really quickly because I know I do it a lot. And then the other thing, of course, is separating out support, breath pressure from everything you're doing here. So once you start to get the separation, you can actually start to control the forces more, right? So this kind of follows suit if you were like following me last week. Think of these different variables that we have to get in balance, and different parts of our voice need different strategies. And if we do that backwards, that's when everything can start to lock up. So that's really the concept here. First and foremost, it seems so simple, but everyone when I start out has this problem where when we talk, it's very visual. So some of these vowels like e, ya on that continuum, people want to do it like this, ya, and that's what I mean by like all the muscles moving together. Ya, ya. When you throw it around like that, it's more likely that it's going to get unstable, and we're putting lots of energy through things. It's actually often as we go higher and higher into our range, it's less and less surface area on the vocal folds, and it's actually going to feel like a more subtle motion and kind of taller, right? And we'll get to all of that too. But that's where a lot of this sort of like squeezing happens. It happens early on in the voice. You can see those reflexes, and we're trying to train them out. So like, just put your hands here and see if you can even just do this, right? Where you're like, yeah, 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 yeah. Right, can I move my tongue, the heel of my tongue, not the front part? So I don't want to go, yeah, 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 because you can see that's going to start to actually move my larynx too much and kind of, yeah, yeah, kind of lock it up. So, yeah, 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 yeah. Can you separate that from wah, 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 ya, ya, wah. So we're learning this muscle control. Another one that I don't cover often is, do you even know where your consonant shapes are being formed? Sometimes when we make consonant shapes, it's just all this big jumble. And so I like to kind of divide them into these different zones, right? So we've got our lip consonants. So we've got like ma, ba, pa, wa. We're trying to move this stuff without the back moving at the same time. So whenever you're moving something in the front, try to keep the back relaxed. When you're moving something in the back, try to keep the front relaxed. And that's sort of this trade-off that can happen. We're just trying to get this feeling just more in our muscle memory. So I might do a drone and do the same thing, go like ma ba pa wa ma ba pa wa. Just feel how they're all different. And then we've got consonants that come from the tip of the tongue to the hard palate. These are the ones where we get a lot of excess motion for people. And again, remember, this seems simple here, but when we go up higher, that can be the thing that's actually holding you back from just like a clean, open, clear range. So like I'll do this. I go ta, da, la, na, and then a little bit of a rolled R, ra, ra. It's kind of, like ultimately, like when we do like English R's, it's ra. It's kind of like a glide actually. So like ra, ra, but it's the same thing like with ya. If we go, we're kind of stuck in it. But if we go, ra, ra, we can get a little more of this sort of hanging and floating sensation. So again, a lot of times the jaw and the tongue are the things that are sort of blocking stuff. So I'm trying to do tongue consonants, but not have the front of my mouth move. So if I'm going like ta da la na ra, ta da la na ra, it's just like the tip of the tongue. You're gonna want to feel these other things. It's gonna feel like they're gonna want to like move and carry the jaw around, and just try to get them separate from that task. So if you think of like when we're singing, we're doing all these little incremental, like tiny, small movements. They build up over time, right? So like when we start to release some of these things, we just get more of this sort of floating kind of draped sensation, which is just better on the vocal folds. Of course, obviously, we don't want to sound like we're like completely hard to hear, sort of like under enunciated to the point where it's kind of like completely floppy. So we have to learn how to do just the right amount of forces at different times. So this just helps me feel this out, so I know the zones where I'm working on. So yeah, I'm doing that. We've got ta da la na ra, and then the last ones are ga and ka ya. So these are all the back of the tongue to the soft palate. So I'm going like this, same thing, like ga ka ya. Again, the front's gonna want to move. You're gonna want to go ga ka ya. When we speak, it's very visual. We see this sort of opening and closing. We want less of that as we extend vowels and we sing long legato phrases. So like ga kaya. So I just kind of have these zones, right? Again, we got ma ba pa wa, ta da la na ra, ga ka ya. There's other things that obviously, but this is just a nice simple approach to feel the front, the middle, and the back. So you're just more aware of when you're moving everything at the same time versus when you need to just move one thing and keep everything else relaxed. So very, very helpful practice. Pair it up with doing this kind of stuff where you go like, when you're humming and you're trying to move at the same time, and you'll feel muscles kind of pull at you, right? So spend some time to really allow that to happen. That's the stretching part of things. Like you really need to make sure that you actually spend a good amount of time doing that, especially in between and around your sort of moments of conditioning, because the thing you're gonna notice is as you try to sing higher and higher, again, your range starts to kind of squeeze and lift up, and then you lose all that fullness and sort of depth in your voice. And then same thing as if you're trying to reach lower and lower, it kind of also does the same thing for the higher range. So this is why like different voice types run into this issue. And for range extension, you have to sort of watch and really think of training from the middle out rather than from like the bottom up. Or if you're a really high voice singer, from the top down. You really want to try and make sure that you always have access to both sides. And so we'll keep going over that. But yeah, the first thing is just, can you actually move the resonators as sort of separate things? Now, it gets harder when we're actually singing because we often have to sort of drop into a sound shape. So here's a really good practice that I do to help us feel some of this muscle isolation and then adding in vocal support. So I might go like this, like wa, we. We're trading between front and back, right? We're going wa, we. And my tongue is going from low, ah, a, e. I'm trying to use that ah, which is kind of like the most neutral of all of these vowels, like ah, wa, as sort of the default. So a and e can kind of fit in that. And if you're holding anything, you're going to notice in the next thing that it's going to start to kind of hold and squeeze. And so we have to practice our ability to sort of like drop into the sensation and feel of each vowel shape and feel like it's just sort of floating there, so that we can actually move it to the next note. So I'm going to do a fifth now, and I'm going like wa, we. And you're going to notice sometimes if it goes in the wrong place, it gets kind of stuck, and then immediately these muscles start to push, and it does take some time. So give yourself a moment, and just know that like when you're actually warming up and all this kind of stuff, like there's always tension that accumulates. So I'm just really aware of all of that extra stuff trying to follow. And I do it a couple times. So if I'm like, wah, way, we, and you're just trying to keep this all still while the other stuff happens. And then, of course, this is where like support stuff comes into play, but it's not really as much engagement as people would think with our support. It's just the fact that if these other things are all holding, it takes more energy and muscling to keep the resonance there, and it sort of like becomes more forced, or what we call forced resonance. And then the support doesn't work as well. So we want this to be detached, and then just allow our support to take over. If you're having trouble with the support thing, right, go back to any of the SOVT slide things so you get that sensation. So going like, my belly just feels like it gently engages out and takes and builds some of that pressure. And then wah, way, we. And you'll start to notice as you get this more and more relaxed, the pressure itself from the resonance that we create will make this start to kind of stretch and sort of slide open like this. It's not that I'm placing it. I'm not like, whoa, I'm trying to hold it, but instead allowing it to naturally kind of extend with that pressure. So you have to sort of follow the sensation of it. And then I just start to make this wider and wider. So you can, that's a fifth, and it seems like we're starting small, but I'm trying to carry that sensation to an octave now, or whatever the interval is, like a sixth, or anything that feels good to play with. You can use your interval training for this. So I'm going like, wah, way, we, and just trying to catch where anything is trying to hold, like we. And again, think of this as like a stretch, right? So don't worry if you don't quite get it the first time. Don't try like harder, but instead just see if you can get it to hang a little bit more. And do a little bit of that kind of gentle stretching. So let's talk a little bit about some of the motion things, because I think with like the jaw and the tongue, sometimes this can be tricky here. So you want to make sure that your jaw isn't taking space by pressing forward. So this is all in this like sort of tension release category. You'll notice if you do that, you kind of muscle push out. Often if your head and your neck is already out of alignment, that's kind of the only way for the jaw, only direction the jaw can go. But really think of it that the jaw just swivels down and back. And it doesn't really move that far. So when people are like, you need to like overly expand your jaw, that's also a problem, right? It just actually has to be kind of neutral and out of the way. And so a thing that you can practice is just breathing with a vowel shape, right? And being like, ah, ah. So it's already kind of set up. So right, anytime we do sort of this extra motion, if I'm like really wrenching at it, that's where things can start to squeeze. So and it's floppy, and you can see if it can kind of move separately, right? So if you're singing and you're like, or is it like this, like, right? Only you can really tell or point that out, because sometimes it's obvious visually, but like it's not always obvious visually. And so you could actually be really hiding tension a lot of times. So you have to kind of check it. So like as I'm singing, always putting my hand in different places and like, and if you notice as you're doing this, as an aside, if you notice like when you're trying to relax everything, we run into this issue sometimes where it starts to sound like an ambiguous vowel, right? I was talking about where it's like hard to tell. It's usually because the tongue is actually too low, because as you're trying to relax the front, the back starts to relax with it, and we need that muscle isolation separation. So if you're like going like, It's losing the integrity of the vowel. Then you just have to go like this. And kind of reset it. Think of the yaw thing. And you can actually reposition it and get a better sense of that. So I highly recommend really like watch yourself in a mirror, pay attention to those things. Those when you're starting to sing high notes, and we'll go into that like particular high note, like low note conditioning in a second. But usually that's the thing that's actually blocking it is some extra sort of flinch or like reflex or other thing is moving at the same time, and it just shouldn't. It takes a lot of focus. Hi, welcome. That's awesome. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions as we go. My main principle here, and it's just the thing that people don't want to spend as much time on, is you need to work on stretching, tension release, and muscle isolation is one of the best ways to actually work on extending your range. It's less is more, try not try. It's this very hard sort of balance that we get. Yeah, let's talk about the tongue retraction thing. That's sort of the next tension release thing I wanted to talk about. So oftentimes, like, there's a couple things that happen with the tongue. Like, it can sometimes push too far forward as a way to try to force sound, or it can pull back like that. And that's going to that sort of muscle retraction is going to lock the tongue in the back. So one thing, like, it's not that you want to push your tongue against your bottom teeth, but you want to be aware of that ability to do this. And sometimes it's really hard with certain consonants. Like when I talked about the hard palate to tongue, sort of middle consonants, like a lot of times they want to go no and kind of pull that way. And you just have to be aware that you're going no, no. Try to send it forward a little bit. Now, you can also feel for some of that pressing tongue retraction tension, not for everybody, but you can feel it right under here. And so sometimes it's like just this awareness of that sort of, it'll press down and be like hard. There's various ways that that'll happen. And you want to instead try to keep it nice and floppy. That also is true for when the tongue is kind of pushing forward against the teeth. There's lots of ways that people are trying to keep their tongue out of their throat. And it really has to be kind of soft because the tongue is the major mover of our vowel shapes. So if your tongue it's like designed to mute things, but if it's overly active, it's muting too many overtones. Oftentimes I find that a great way to feel this out is when we go from a bright to a dark vowel. So like A to O or Ah to O, and we're rounding our lips. So this is part of that muscle isolation thing. It's like moving the front and rounding a vowel without the tongue trying to pull back, sort of create like a spoon shape. So think of it like, this is why like classical teachers will sometimes say like, think of a flat tongue. It's not that the whole tongue should be flat, but sometimes this sort of front and middle part, should you think of it almost kind of going out the back molars with the jaw. Yeah. We're gonna we'll talk about that as well. With the tongue stuff, there's some consonant tricks too. I think that are kind of interesting. So we'll go over that. But yeah, so one thing we'll do is it seems really simple, but I'm just trying to go and you might notice, like, and this is for everyone, like when I'm working on warming up my voice, it's really about separating out the systems so I have control over the sensations a little bit more. So if I'm going kind of rounding versus trying to keep my tongue more neutral while I move my lips around it. This is really important as we go up higher because the subtle rounding allows us to build up resonance and momentum and helps us with mixing. So if you're doing that and at the same time your tongue is pulling back, that's going to start to squeeze the mechanism, and it will usually lead to a voice crack where the voice has to release the pressure and bail up into a different position. So practice that kind of stuff. This is why I do like and be messy about it, right? Like you can actually just play around with moving that while the other stuff is happening. So you'd be like, there's there's two different things happening, right? This is shaping the vowel up here, and my support is engaging out to get the pitch to rise. And the two work together, but it's really important to feel them actually slightly disconnected. Remember, my teacher back in the day would always say this too, like when it's working well, the systems feel kind of disconnected actually, which means that they're not like overly influencing each other in terms of when you're engaging your belly, these muscles start to squeeze, or when you're relaxing this, your belly starts to relax, right? So it becomes this juggling act. So yeah, let me answer this now about the tongue thing. So there's a couple things. One sort of interesting trick is you can put like an almond or something right here on your tongue and practice just this sort of rounding thing. And you can also sort of feel, be careful with that. There's only particular vowel shapes like doing a, o, a, wa, anything sort of rounding over. And you can feel if your tongue is starting to try to move around. It just helps us bring awareness. Another one is using tongue rolling as actually a particular exercise to relax the tongue. So I'll do like, try with different, moving from different vowels. And you go like, ar, ir, ur, er, and try to keep the jaw loose, but har, er. What's happening essentially, you're putting breath pressure through that position, and it starts to vibrate and relax the tongue. It might start to kind of feel a little warm. You can actually do this for a little bit and practice like as weird as it is, it's still also an SOVT style practice, right? Just like a lip trill. So like, right, that's a lip trill, and then a tongue trill. If you're having trouble doing tongue rolling, it does take some time to practice doing that. Actually, like used to not be able to roll my R's very much because we don't use it very often in like the English dialect. But you over time, just think of going like da 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 da, and then you learn to get the right breath pressure underneath it. And I used to have a good amount of tongue tension and still kind of work through that. And actually rolling the R's and learning how to do that helped me just gain more control and sort of soften that tongue stuff. So yeah, exactly. If you're a Spanish speaker, you use a lot of the R. And so, a lot of these sort of Romance style languages will have more of that. As you do this, be careful that you don't pinch this sort of nasopharynx, kind of like get tight here. Try to see if you can keep some space as well. That leads me to another one, right? So sometimes we get really tight up right here in the nasopharynx, which kind of goes through here in the sinuses. If you have allergies, these things are going to affect that kind of stuff. But one thing you can do is actually work on snoring on purpose to relax your palate. So if you're going like, you can actually feel that space. And so we're talking about just using vibration to kind of shake loose this stuff. And then you might realize after doing that for a little bit, like helps you get that feeling. And then your breath, you're like, oh, and I could have way more resonance kind of build from that sort of space. So this is all really, really important work that gets neglected. And it's actually, my whole point here is like, that's where the healthy range extension happens, is to make sure that you maintain that feeling of freedom and space, and then put the power into it. So I always say placement over power. And then once you get this relaxed enough, you can actually start to work on vocal support exercises in a totally different way. So like use staccato exercises, for example. What helps us do is we are just in a vowel shape, and then we start engaging our support into it. So this is why I do this kind of stuff. Like I have an ah vowel and I'm like, ha, 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 ha. And I try not to have too much happen here. So if I'm like, ha, 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 and I'm doing something to try to force the vowel, it might happen more with the more narrow vowels like E and A, like we were talking about. But try to pay attention to that. Can I just drop into my belly? Ha, 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 ha. And I'd rather you be a little under pitch and kind of learn to slide up into it at first than try to force or cheat it by going ha, ha, and trying to follow the direction. So again, one of these weird perception things with the voice is in order to sing higher, we think of actually sinking down, grounding down and out with our lower abdominal muscles, and that creates that lift. And so if you're following the direction of the pitch, we often get stuck in that, and that's also where that squeezing happens. So it maps backwards from what you would think, and you just have to get comfortable with that. Like, it's sort of a little silly, but like piano goes from left to right, doesn't go up and down. That's like our perception of overtones and things like that. And so I think of really just expanding out a little more horizontally, right, with my lower body. So ha 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 ha. That's going to be a really good practice, and then you can start to make this harder and harder. Like that's a really simple version, but I might take something where I'm like maybe doing like ha 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 ha, and you'll just notice that you're actually probably not set up fast enough, and that's what's causing a lot of these habits. So slow it down. Instead of like ha ha ha, thinking like that with staccato, think of it like your belly is already expanded, and then you're pulsing against it, and it's like more of a press as we get up higher and higher. So like ha 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 ha, and then my body can learn to do it faster and faster, right? So it's a lot of times just there's so many things happening when we sing a phrase. We're moving through all these vowel shapes and consonants, moving up and down, that it all just gets scrambled, and then people are just sort of like squeezing their whole body and like gripping down to try and make a sound happen, and it's actually not going to be helpful. And so less is more when it comes to this kind of stuff. And staccato vowel stuff really helps you with that. So then I would try different vowels, right? And be like, hey, 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 right? A lot of times people want to go, hey, and make a diphthong. Just make it, hey, 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 hey. It's really interesting. You realize that you're actually trying to make like too much motion with that vowel. And I remember like the A vowel, because it's in the middle, it can be really hard to feel out what that's supposed to really actually be like. Hey, in the middle, right? So if you're having trouble with that, go through the glide again and be like, essentially like it's a zone, right? When the tongue is in a certain area, those overtones start to light up, and then we have more of the A sound. So I just do this. I'd be like, hey, 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 right? All with my belly. He, he. This is probably one of the hardest ones for a lot of people. It wants to go he, but it's a he. I'm just trying to keep it pretty still. And then you could practice doing the slide thing again and be like, wah, way, we. And hopefully even you can see, like, as I've been doing this, it's been opening up more. And I'm doing kind of less, right? So it's an efficiency thing. So think of it like, again, like an athlete is really training what actual muscles are making the thing happen. And can I get rid of all the other things? And that's good technique. That's really what I think of it as, is like technique is freeing. There's multiple ways to get to this sort of placement, different parts of the voice. But that's really like the main things. You can't lose that when you're working on your range extension. Now, one of the ways that I like, there's some different practices here. Like one thing that's really helpful as you're kind of going up higher and higher is to think of using more agility, right? Using sweeping exercises that kind of move through a broader part of the range. That's all going to be really helpful. So this is one that I really like, where I go 1 2 1 3 4 3 5 6 5 3 4 3 1. It's supposed to be a little disorienting so that you stop trying to follow it around and work on just trying to keep a solid vowel just open and relaxed. So I might go like one, and then I speed it up and I go like one. You see, like the more free this gets, the more my voice can just be buoyant and sort of float. And then you can expand this. You can make it instead of 1 3 and 5, I do 1 3 5 and 8, and I might go like this, like we tend to want to sort of hold and lock up on the high notes. It's very common, right? So think of it, it's like the roller coaster phenomenon. You're like, oh, I'm getting over the edge, and we kind of do that. So just try to move it faster and faster. Don't try to add more energy or make it like like harder and push into it or louder, but instead, wah, kind of move it like that. Notice for anything happening, right? I used to like one of my sort of habits that I worked out is I would like look up to the left, and that was like, and my teacher would be like, "What are you looking at?" And I was like, for some reason, that's just like was my way of following the pitches up. And maybe it's sort of we get nervous as we go up to high notes, so a lot of times it's like, don't flinch, don't flinch, don't flinch. Just keep everything neutral, keep my support engaged. And then try to move pretty quickly. So I really like this kind of stuff. So that way you're not like holding on the high note and you're less likely to get static, but you can just kind of tap it and feel that out. And that way we're kind of stretching it like that, right? We're always rounding up and down and back. So another one that's really nice is doing this one where I go, it's kind of like a staccato technique. Yeah, so it goes like this, like, yeah, I'm using the staccato thing to continually sort of tap down into my support, and then just try to keep that sort of neutral vowel. And you can do this with different vowels, but I'm using a pretty wide pattern. It's going like 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it's now, as we go higher and higher, we have to think of using a little more sort of space to round. We round over this way, and we create this internal sort of back space. It's really, again, I'm not like holding it open, but it happens as we go up higher and higher, sort of the angle of the vowel and the shape feels like a little more vertical. And so I highly recommend, as you're working on upper range extension, we're talking about mixing, try to switch to more rounded like O vowels, or instead of like go right? That actually really, really helps us. And we have to sort of feel that subtle modification. If you can't do muscle isolation, you can't do that. That's actually how we navigate the overtones. And it's less with like a lot of force. So anything where you are practice rounding over, but just still try to relax your tongue is going to really help. The tongue is one of the biggest sort of barriers to the upper belt range, mixed voice technique. It just tries to lock down, and we have to just gain control over that. So you can do these irregular patterns that go up to a 6 are really nice. So like, holding or anything, any of that. I just try to keep it more neutral. So the call all comes back to that earlier concept of doing like wah, way, we, getting into a vowel shape and then allowing it to just sort of hover like that and float with the pressure. It takes a practice. So practice like sliding around, then practice sort of dropping into specific spots, like using the staccato stuff, and a variation of those two things. And you're going to be successfully working on all of that. There's, of course, head voice range extension is a whole other phenomenon too. We might not have a lot of time to cover all of that, but please ask questions. That sort of concept of getting taller just gets more extreme as we go up into head voice. So I'm like, and you need the stretch like that. And you need to make sure that you actually get resonance happening in your vocal folds are properly sealed with that resonance, right? And then you can put support into it, but you can't do it until you get that stuff. So even, like when a very popular exercise that I do is this little chord compression thing. And then once I have the feeling, then I try to surf on it. And then I stretch up to a note and come back, right? So don't just hold up into a high note, but come back. Yeah. So, head voice is one of those things, or falsetto. And just to know, right, sometimes people get confused about these terms. They're essentially the same term, but sometimes people use falsetto as a way to explain a style. In particular, the like loose chord compression, very under supported kind of boy bandy like head voice. That's like a breathier tone. That's kind of what people sometimes call falsetto, but really it's the same mechanism. And so I don't really think of that as like a separate register in any way. With head voice though, it can be a sign, right, that like if there's a lot of squeezing and things like that, or not enough chord compression, either or, which is, again, strangely enough, when we don't have enough chord compression, it causes the muscles around it to try to hold it in place, and that causes squeezing. It just feels like kind of goes, kind of squeezes in like that. if you're having that, sometimes it's a sign that you just need to rest the voice. We'll talk about the recovery phase when you're conditioning your voice, which is really important. But yeah, sometimes it can be an indicator. Um, Hi, welcome. Sometimes it can be an indicator that your voice is getting fatigued, right? And so when we feel out those things, and you feel like your onset's starting to get really hard, it's like that kind of stuff. Like that's gonna start to tell you that you need to stop and let it decompress. Do more humming style exercises. Um, one thing you want to do is maybe try to work on the chord compression stuff if you've been losing head voice. It doesn't mean I'm forcing at it. I'm just using the consonant to coax my muscles in a certain way. When I go like, "G, g," it seems really silly, right? Again, but the G sound is actually, it's not there, but it's right before I make the G sound. If I go, "G," there's this moment where the vocal folds come together and the pressure stops. It happens on certain vowels too, like when we do a glottal and we go like, uh, oh, uh, uh, right? That sort of sound. You'll notice that there's a belly connection to it, right? If I go, like, uh, you'll feel your support start to engage. That's when there's good chord compression, you can actually use your support. If there isn't, then it starts to sound like a sort of loose whistle. And you're going to want to do this kind of stuff like gee, gee, until you can hear that really high overtone. Again, also with head voice, people tend to not place the overtone high enough and perceptively. It's usually like kind of outside your head, analog space, not real. We don't really feel that part of our head. So it just kind of feels like it's floating up here. So higher, breathe with the shape of a loose ah, right? That sort of dopey feeling like gee, 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 gee. And when I can start to get that little internal stretch feeling, that means that I'm going in the right direction. That's okay. You know, if you're, I know you're here late, but you can always go back and we'll have this up so you can follow along on the whole thing. Um, uh, okay, yeah. Let me look at this. So, F4. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I know what you're talking about because it's sort of a lower part of head voice actually, and so it's hard to get good, solid, full chord compression in low head voice, and that's because it's pretty low support there. Um, uh, Yeah. Oh, that's okay. This is good. And this is a kind of a concept of where we get to mixing, right? Where I think sometimes the limitation is chest and head voice are really a teaching metaphor for a transition of resonance. And so and these different variables that we play into it. So ultimately, when you learn to sort of slide between the two, you start to get to this point where you can actually keep some of that chest voice like support, but still it borrows some of the lightness of head voice, so it doesn't sound too chest voicey, right? I think that's what you're talking about. That's a mixed voice kind of a technique thing. So what I practice is doing like descending down into from head voice into chest voice, and practice getting this sort of rounder sensation. It's really about resonance more than anything else, and it does take some time sort of fiddling around with it. So what you might find is as you're working on your mixed voice, you get kind of tight, tension builds up because we're using things wrong. You got to take a break, practice throughout the day, come back once you've stretched again and loosened it up, and then try it again and until you get little moments where you can feel it. So I would do like these kinds of things where I go like and try to come back to a chest voice. This is also the other funny thing is like when you're working that area, um, uh, you have to make sure you can get your chest voice up high enough so you're comfortable with that as well, and you start to learn to kind of cross them over. So that's go back to some of my mixed voice technique stuff too that I've done recently, and that's going to be really helpful in this process to find that sort of light tone, right? So a lot of dynamics are less about like holding or having less energy and more actually about registration transitions. So if I'm like and use staccato, right? So again, like a lot of times we just have this strain sort of built into our muscle memory as a habit, and it takes some time to get rid of it. I promise you, like I've been through this cycle. And then, but once you can feel out the right placement, and setup, it's all really in the setup, right? It's the moment when we take our breath. My teacher would always say, if you have problems with a high note, check the note before, then it's in your breath. It's really that makes for the strain, and it happens really quickly, right? The second we start singing. Um, uh, yeah. So yeah. So let me like, keep reading, follow up with you guys. Yeah, uh-huh, and then it's, with the same it's the same thing as, like, what does it mean to sound, like chest voice, right? It's just a more full and particular kind of overtone, but we can always balance between the 2, and so I highly recommend, like, the best way to find actually good chest voice is first finding the right placement with head voice, and then learning to put, support pressure and maybe a little bit of twang into it, and so you can think of these as kind of like separate little elements that come together, so, um so yeah, I would think of borrowing again from the top, and it makes sense, right? If you're having trouble uh, with head voice stuff, that's going to give you a lot of trouble with certain vowel shapes, right? And everyone, again, like this is what's hard is like everyone has slightly different reasons why it's out of balance, and this is why it's like you got to come in, do a one-on-one to really get down to the bottom of I think some of these specific things that you guys are talking about. But yeah. Yeah, this is kind of like the concept, to is like as we go higher and higher, if we're building tension into it, it pulls our voice up into a higher place. And this leads me to I should get to the next thing, which is how do we actually get our voice to extend down lower? Different strategy. And this is what's so hard, right? So when we're going lower, we actually need more mask and we need more of the bright overtones that help us to sympathetically vibrate the rib cage, get just the right kind of um, balance of sounds. Because again, our issue when we go down is we tend to try to push down, or our larynx is so high that it just can't even relax down to that area. So there's a couple things. One, work on vocal fry. It's a good indicator if your voice is really tired. Yeah, you can't do that because it's super relaxed vocal support. So I'd be like, yeah, and actually just try to see if you can get that going. A little air bubbles are escaping from the vocal folds. Practice more relaxed vocal support. So instead of like our kind of pressurized thing, which is more on the higher continuum, think of using more of the ha. And now I'm not pushing air out, but instead I'm trying to create like a warm fog. So you can kind of feel it on your hand. We're doing a resistance with a more open mouth. So it's like you're gonna fog a mirror, right? When we're nervous, when we've been singing a lot, this stuff starts to go away. That's why you have to come back and forth as you're working on high notes. Do them in little bursts, come back to low notes, and actually try to get brighter overtones first. It'll help to stabilize the pitch down low, and then you can start to stretch around that. So with that technique, I do this kind of thing because I'm a tenor too, and I totally understand as you work your high notes, and as it gets later in the night, some of my notes are going to go away. That's just part of the nature of the voice type. But I'll do this kind of stuff. And I put my hand here to really feel out if anything's trying to lift, try to ground myself down. Be like, now, that M, that creates more twang, sort of resonance. So I'm feeling that mask and a little bit of a brighter vowel shape. So more like ah. So, and you're gonna feel this and hear this sort of like a chest rumble kind of thing, right? It's like but it's bright overtones with relaxed breath support. So it's like I'm going and then that might be a really bright tone, and you're like, okay, that's not what I want. But once you get that, you can actually practice stretching on top of it, and it just helps to coax the voice into the right place. So if I'm like, and that helps me from not pressing my larynx. So you might even put your hand here and be, I want it to be kind of low, but still pretty relaxed. So, So that's what's hard about it, right? It's loose energy, but we need that high format. So once we learn to separate muscle isolation being my big point to healthy voice range extension, you can actually start to change your strategies. Low singing has that thicker vocal fold phonation and it's more compressed that way. And then as we go this way, the vocal folds actually stretch back and away from each other. So there's less chord compression or less surface area that it's on. And it goes this way. So you can think about it when we go like, when we get that stretch, it's like I've provided space for the vocal folds and the whole mechanism of the larynx to actually angle itself appropriately. So a lot of times we're just kind of getting in our own way. It's really frustrating. But we're often like holding back the ability for these muscles to get into the right ideal position for the resonance to happen. And that's really the guide. So resonance is always pretty much your guide. And that's going to be the trick, right? Is so if you've been doing a lot of high singing, you need to go back, try to see if you can just get back to a relaxed hum. Might be like, do some stretching, move this around. And it's really important to note that the voice, just like with other things in the body, goes through a recovery phase. And really what's happening is like, you'll notice it when the tissue starts to sound a little more frayed, right? You having trouble getting that formant, the resonance. It's like, we don't always want that in our tone when we're singing, but if you can't make it happen in your practice, then it's a sign that like things are swollen here. And it means that the tissue is in this recovery phase. It's a different texture. So you pay attention to that and you'll know that you're getting to the point of you've over conditioned or it's just up to that precipice. If you push over that, just like with athletic stuff, you're going to injure yourself and it's going to make it longer to recover. So you actually have to have off days. And that's why we do it in our like 30-day thing. We have like an off day and like someone come in and sing so you can just kind of listen. You have to know when to get off your voice and let it rest. Sometimes like if it's really feeling tired, give it like 36 hours, like a day and a half, not just like a 1 day sleep on it. And then once you're hearing resonance back in your voice and you do those like droning exercises and things like that, then you can go back into some conditioning. Yeah. Let me, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. This is the whole point. It's like if you're used to doing just one register, and it's like your habit, that's going to lead to some issues in your range extension. And even if you don't sing in head voice, it's really really helpful so you can get the right placement. So if I'm up here and I'm like, I can just, it's like almost like a thought, right? The change of overtone all of a sudden from head voice to chest voice, but you have to learn the sensations in order to navigate it, right? Singing is very like tactile sensation based actually. And so you really want to go with that instead of, I don't know, you have to like sit with it instead of like being too conceptual about it. This is why some people can just learn to sing by like listening and imitating, and over time, like find their voice. You have to really be present with what you're feeling and the sensation. That's how you're going to get good range extension in general. And you'll notice as you are consistent with it and you don't just try to push harder and harder. Like I've been there too. We get like obsessive. I want to like get that note. So I'm just going to hit it over and over again. But if I'm feeling like I'm adding more force and tension, that means I have to step back and readjust, come off of my voice for a little bit and then come back to it, stretch and see if I can do it in an effortless place. Otherwise, we're just training that sort of like force and tension into the sound. So little bursts and like tapping up on high notes for a while is totally great. And then incrementally adding more and more challenge, more sustain into your sound. When it's swollen, so it'll sound like so usually when the voice is having health problems, the middle starts to disappear and you get like low notes and high notes like uh and it'll kind of like crack in between the two. That's like a really big one. That's like means you should go to a laryngologist at that point. But like you'll notice that and it starts to sound like a little bit like just a little raspy like that, right? Like and a little frayed. If you have a sudden loss of voice, that's can be like a vocal emergency, right? And you never want to get to that point. So that's the main thing is you'll start to notice it because it'll just start to sound like swollen, like a little like the overtones can't get really clear, and you have a little more distortion in the sound. And then over time, that turns into calluses from lots of rubbing and pressure. The voice is trying to, like the tissue is trying to protect itself. So it starts to harden in places. And then you have to push harder to make the sound. And that's going to be a sign, right, that like things are way too tight. So that's what's so hard is like once the muscles get all tight, like your range immediately starts to kind of separate out. It's usually like you lose the middle actually though, right? And then some, obviously the very tippy top of your head voice. But yeah, this is the thing though, is it's like incremental practice, focus on releasing tension, finding resonance, and then watching for habits. And you'll note that high notes start to just become available and they don't have to be loud. So like sometimes people think like I need to push out more air as I go up to this bigger moment. It's the exact opposite. Whatever you think, like it's usually like the exact opposite with the voice. And it's about balancing forces. So it's like, I need to sing really low, actually think high resonance. I need to sing really high, think low and grounded. So yeah, yeah, that's an example of some of that kind of stuff. And that would be like a moment where we'd want to like work on that gap and like, maybe even just try sliding like notice what happens when you get to that spot. Like I can go back and forth a little more chest voice, a little more head voice. Teaching metaphors again, right? It's just like it's kind of how we hear it that makes the big difference. But like you just want to slide and notice if anything's trying to bite down, right? And it's just a big glorified yaw. That's why I talk about this. Like that's probably where your break range is, and that's usually where vocal problems start to happen. Is it kind of opens up from that break range, and so you just want to, the more you can kind of smooth that out, the better. It's like a gear shift in a car. Less likely things are going to stall out, and grit often can sometimes be a sign that things are squeezing back here, right? If it's not there in other parts of your voice. It's a sign that like this is how people do grit singing, right? Is like, again, like these things can be not a bad thing if you can control them, but the false vocal fold area kind of collapses down to the vocal folds. And it's like a little bit of distortion against it. And it creates that in just the right way. And then you get to do a little more of that sort of throat singing kind of grit sound. So it sounds like that's there. You know what I would do is more of the like yaw kind of stretching stuff and, try to do it from top down and be like, yeah, 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 yeah. Getting the vertical stretch. It sounds like it's compressing, like you're going more chest voicey. And so that'll cause that sort of that grit sensation. So more working on head voice really is the answer there. Being able to descend down from head voice, like because then eventually once you get that ability, I can be up here. No, 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 no. Just showing that it actually doesn't have to be as much force. And it's usually all this extra stuff that is being carried along. Once you can find that, yeah, 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 you can actually start to put more pressure and more energy into it. It's usually just about opening up that overtone. And then it starts to oscillate with vibrato. And that's kind of the extent that we can get on our volume. So yeah, exactly. So paying attention to where these tension habits start to play a role, that's what restricts our range, right? That's the main thing. If you do this over time, your voice just gets healthier and all of a sudden high notes become more available, right? So it's just the hard truth of it. It does take some time, some playing around, looking in a mirror, putting your hands in different places. Like that's real voice training. Doing like endless reps, like sometimes we get to that point, like, but it's, that's usually just so we can have a different repetition, a different time to sort of like feel it out. But don't just do it over and over again because that's not going to really help so much. Just a constant practice every day for a little bit. And all of a sudden, like the vocal folds become more elastic. That's what's so cool is like, this is a process. This is the conditioning part, right? So it's like the ligaments in the vocal folds actually stretch through more, and and it becomes more elastic with trained vocalists. So that's this ability, but it's not through like pressure. It's actually through flexibility, right? So the vocal folds themselves, like we kind of want to get out of the way as much as possible, right? So we never sing we don't really want to sing with our throat unless we're purposefully trying to do throat singing. But even that comes from a very, very light technique. It's much lighter than people would think. And then you can kind of go from there. Uh, yeah, I know. Isn't this funny? This is the whole point of the live streams, and there's never enough time to answer all the questions. So I try to keep them in like one topic as much as possible. But like the voice is an interconnected system. So, I ultimately recommend yeah, keep coming back to these, check out some of the other videos. I try to cover different topics that all relate to each other. And if you have things in particular you want me to like go over, just let me know at one of these and I'll put it into one of my next one. I usually have to plan them like a few months in advance so they can like generate them and people have a chance to sort of see them. Camila and I take turns. So it's based on availability sometimes. But yeah, no, I love that you have all these questions. And this is like the whole point in practice is to feel these things out, to understand your voice, to know when it's giving you warning signs and when it's telling you sing more. Like my teacher would always say, when it's good, it's good. And that means like when it's feeling good, that's like the time to work with it. And if it's not, that's the time to do more stretching. And it might be in recovery mode. So yeah, like, don't overwork it when it's in recovery mode. Like it's in intervals for a little bit, and then you learn to be more consistent as you're a professional. But even professionals have to rest, and that's what's so hard. Sometimes, like an athlete gets injured and they have to stop a show, right? Like it's much. We treat athletes in a slightly different way than sometimes when a performer has like an acute, immediate injury problem. Like they should not sing on that if you want them to ever be singing again. Like we don't want to force people into that if they're hurting, right? So we get a little bit of that rasp, a little bit of fatigue as we're practicing and we're doing lots of singing, but that means that you should do the 36-hour rest thing. If you've completely lost your voice, go seek a medical professional. Like I always tell people, like if you suddenly went blind, you'd be like pretty worried. And like our voice is really important. And so if you're really, really struggling with it, like sometimes there's nothing that vocal technique is going to do, and you need like an expert in that department. I know a little bit about it, but it's not like I'm a voice teacher, and that's so I go more on like how to work on songs and ear training and these other things and musicality rather than like so deep into the medical side. Um, uh, I know this is so hard. Yeah, and that's the other thing again is if you have really particular questions, like that's why checking in one-on-one is really helpful. Like a single session for some people can really help you go in the right direction. I can just tell you like from experience what it looks like you're doing, right? And what might be, it's like a tool belt, like what might be off. And then from there we can, I think target like specific exercises that are helpful for you. Cause that's the other thing is like, you can't just do all the exercises you find online. You have to pair them up with what you're noticing and understand the mechanism a little bit to really work it appropriately. Just like a physical trainer, right? Like you could train all these random muscles and it's not necessarily going to give you your desired results. And then sometimes, all out of balance, they just kind of go away because one, maybe you hurt yourself and you have to stop, you're too sore. So, yeah, I know the 1,000 questions. No, this is the total point. And again, we're athletes, so like we can understand these things and sometimes still be struggling for all sorts of reasons, right? Outside of even our vocal practice. But yeah, so remember the recovery phase. I use the droning and the overtone kind of work and sort of more relaxed singing as a way to sort of check in with my voice, see how it's feeling, and then start to extend from there, from the middle out, being aware of not pressing or locking. And yeah, check out any of the stuff with like mixed voice singing. There's plenty of things on head voice work and troubleshooting. And all of these things together lead to a healthy, extended range. And I don't mean like whistle tone and like super low, like throat singing stuff. That's kind of more, those are like really like extended techniques, not like what I'm talking about with this, like growing your voice. So hopefully that's been helpful. And I love that you guys all have so many questions. Keep coming back to these and I will answer them, in as much of a like concise sort of flow as possible, right? Because it's easy to kind of like jump around to a lot of different topics. So try to get them focused, but this one is like kind of involves everything a little bit. So yeah, have a great rest of your day, rest of your night, wherever you're coming from. And I will catch you all next time. All right, take care.